Get across the midterms now. We've seen Donald Trump at a rally earlier today. He's really trying to rev up the base at the moment, particularly with some strong language around immigration. Is that going to cost him with the so-called urban Republican mothers out there? Will the Democrats be able to get back the House, even if the Senate's looking like a pretty tough ask? Well, joining me live now is Cyprus College Professor of Political Science, Peter Mathews. Peter, thanks very much for your time today. All the polls are suggesting at the moment, I think, just about all the polls anyway, that the Democrats will likely get the House but fall short in the Senate. Can we believe the polls, given what happened, of course, in the presidential election in 2016?
This time I think we can more than less believe the polls because it's a snapshot in time and there are scientific samples, but there could be small little errors in it because sometimes the pollster cannot reach everyone. For example, people on cell phones are not always reachable. So I would say generally the polls are accurate, that the Democrats are going to take over the House, but the Senate is a different question. It's going to be very close over there. In fact, the Republicans might even win a few seats in the Senate. It's possible. That's a different scene because the senators are elected from states, 2 from each state. 35 senators out of 100 are up for re-election. And don't forget that out of the 35, most of them are Democrats up for re-election, about 3/4 of them.
So this is the anomaly, right, Peter, that this time around it makes it really hard for the Democrats. They're a better chance next time around, depending on how the polls are then, but that's a much more feasible time for them to be able to get the Senate.
Yes, the next time around they might be able to get the Senate, but it's interesting things that are coming up in the polls, and it's showing that 62% of women are voting Democratic this time, and only 35% of men are voting Democratic. And it's very interesting also with African Americans. 88% of African Americans are voting Democratic, 66% of Latinos voting Democratic. So young people are the key. If young people turn out in heavy droves for Democrats, Democrats will sweep the House by even larger margins.
This is, I think, the more fascinating thing about that. I mean, a lot of people have not been surprised that women not supporting Donald Trump overall, but why are the Democrats only getting 35% of men?
Well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? It's probably because, well, 49% of the men are going for the Republicans, and only 48% of men are going for Democrats. The reason is probably because the men, many of the conservative men feel a lot more like the women have been getting too many things, in their favor. And the country's changing. That's a backlash, unfortunately, because the country is changing. Women, people of color, ethnic minorities, and young people are gaining more power, as some of the older white men have been losing some of the power. But it shouldn't be a win, a zero-sum game. I think everyone can gain together, but some folks are not educated enough to understand that. And they're resentful about the old order being, in their views, the old order being shunned away and new order coming in. So that's why a lot of men, not all of them, but a number of them are going for the Republicans to hang on to the old guard, in a sense, and we'll see what happens with that.
So if all this plays out, Peter, the actual impact, are we going to see Donald Trump really quite shackled in the similar way that Barack Obama was towards the end of his presidency? It was a case of executive order where he could manage that, but not too much else?
Yes, absolutely, because when the Democrats take over the House, starting with tomorrow's election, beginning of the year, they're going to be able to block a lot of the legislation that Trump wants to push through. They're going to be able to also maybe overturn some of his executive orders. And therefore, the president, not only is that, he's also vulnerable to possible charges of impeachment that could be voted upon in the House. And they'll have the majority to vote for impeachment if they decide there's enough evidence against the president. And that's going to hamstring him from getting things done because he'll be diverted to fighting off a negative attack, and that in his view, and he won't be able to concentrate on getting more of the platform that he wants. Although so far he's gotten quite a bit in terms of his tax cuts, in terms of those kinds of things. But the immigration reform, he hasn't been able to get that yet. He's also hammered on immigrants coming in from the south of the border. We'll see what happens if he's in his party's in the minority in the House. That can slow him down considerably.
Just finally, Peter, I want to get your take on perhaps some of the governor races we should be keeping an eye on. I know it's a bit in the background compared to the House and the Senate race, but what are you keeping an eye on here?
The governor's race are very important as well, because the governor and the state legislatures in most states, they all determine how the lines are drawn for all the districts, for the House districts, for the state assembly districts, the state Senate districts. The governor and legislature in most states actually have the power to do that. And the majority of states are in Republican hands right now. About 35 states out of 50 are in Republican hands, and they have been able to gerrymander the nation's districts for the House, and therefore give the Republicans an advantage. You know what's remarkable? The Republicans got less votes than Democrats in the last few elections for the House for the presidency, and yet they control those two very important organs of government. Now they control the Supreme Court, 5-4.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting how they're in the minority, but they have the majority of power at this point. We'll see what happens on tomorrow.
It's pretty amazing, this gerrymandering that is so widespread because, well, both sides do it, so they both continue to do it. Is there any actual thought of that this would ever change? This was fascinating history to this too, Peter, that it was first, this word was first came up in part because of the shape that was drawn to make sure that, I can't remember which side it was, but they were maximising the way they'd get votes was the shape of a salamander.
That's exactly right. It was Eldridge Gerry, who was in the governor of Massachusetts,
there you go,
who drew that district to look like a salamander so he can have his advantage for his party. And that's been going on throughout the years, and that's something that goes against democracy because you don't want to undermine the one person, one vote principle, which gerrymandering actually does. And it gives unfair advantage to one group or one party or one ethnicity over the other. And that goes against the one person, one rule vote for democracy. And we need to get over that and have more objective panels draw the districts, as they've been doing in certain states like California.
Well, we'll see if that change becomes. It might be a bit ambitious given the current climate over there in US politics. Peter Mathews, though, from the Cyprus College, Professor of Political Science. Thanks for that.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.